Imagine standing outside your front door on a perfectly clear afternoon. The birds are singing, the sun is warm on your face, your children are laughing somewhere behind you in the yard, and then you look to the west and you stop because something is wrong. Something is very, very wrong. There is a wall on the horizon, not a wall of brick, not a wall of stone, a wall of pure black earth rolling toward you like the end of the world, 1,000 feet tall, 60 miles wide, moving at 60 miles per hour. You have 3 minutes. You grab your children, you run inside, you shove wet towels under every door, every crack, every gap you can find. You hold your family close in the dark and you wait. And then it hits. The sound alone is enough to make you believe the world is ending. The sky goes completely black in the middle of the afternoon, darker than any night you have ever seen. The dust pours through the walls, through the ceiling, through the air itself. Every breath you take is dirt. People who lived through this called them black blizzards. And in the 1930s, in the heart of America, they happened every single week. This is the story of the worst environmental catastrophe in American history, and the most daring, the most ambitious, the strangest solution the United States government ever attempted. A wall of trees, almost 2,000 miles long, stretching from Canada all the way down to Texas. This is the story of why America built it, and what happened when they did. To understand why America planted a wall of trees across an entire continent, you first have to understand the Great Plains itself. The Great Plains is the vast, flat heart of America. It stretches from the Dakotas south through Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and into Texas. For most of recorded history, this land looked exactly the same. Not farmland, not cities, not roads. Grass. But not just any grass, ancient, deep-rooted, living prairie grass that had been growing in this soil since the last ice age. Buffalo grass, blue grama, big blue stem. These grasses didn't just sit on top of the earth. Their roots went 6 feet down, 8 feet down, sometimes 10 feet into the ground. They were the skeleton of the land. They held the soil together through drought, through fire, through blizzard. They had been doing this job for 10,000 years without ever failing. And underneath that ancient carpet of grass, 30 to 60 million buffalo roamed. This was a system in perfect balance. The buffalo grazed the grass and moved on, the grass grew back, the soil stayed rich and dark and deep. The Lakota, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, the Kiowa, the peoples who lived here, they understood this balance. They moved with the land. They never stayed long enough to break it. Then the settlers came. After the Civil War, the United States government did something that seemed, at the time, like a miracle of generosity. They offered free land, 160 acres, yours, for free, under the Homestead Act. All you had to do was live on it and farm it. Hundreds of thousands of families loaded everything they owned into wagons and came west. And here is where the tragedy begins. These farmers came from places where rain fell reliably, where rivers ran full year-round, where you could plow a field and trust the sky to water it. They looked at the Great Plains and they did not see a fragile, ancient ecosystem balanced on the edge of survival. They saw potential. They saw farmland. And so they plowed. They tore up the grass that had held this continent together since before human memory. In the first decade of the 1900s, millions of acres of prairie were turned under the plow. In the 1910s, when the First World War sent wheat prices soaring through the roof, the plowing accelerated. "Wheat will win the war," the posters said, and the farmers believed it. They plowed millions more acres. They bought bigger tractors. They went faster and farther and deeper. By 1930, over 100 million acres of ancient grassland had been destroyed. And then the rain stopped. The drought began in 1930, and it did not stop. 1 year passed, the crops failed. 2 years, the soil dried and cracked. 3 years, the topsoil, that dark, beautiful, irreplaceable topsoil that had taken 10,000 years to build, turned to powder. And without the roots of the ancient grass to hold it in place, the wind took it. On April 14, 1935, the worst dust storm in American history swept across the Great Plains. It became known as Black Sunday. The cloud was 60 miles wide and 8,000 feet tall. It moved at 65 miles per hour and turned the entire sky from horizon to horizon into absolute darkness. People who survived it described what they felt with words they never used again. I thought it was the judgment of God. I couldn't see my hand in front of my face. I got down on my knees on the kitchen floor and I held my children and I prayed. The dust traveled hundreds of miles. It reached Chicago. It reached Washington, D.C. It reached ships sailing in the Atlantic Ocean 200 miles from the American coastline. Red dust from Oklahoma fell like snow on the streets of New York City. And this was not a single event. Between 1930 and 1940, there were hundreds of these storms. Thousands of Americans died from dust pneumonia, their lungs slowly, painfully filling with earth. Farm animals suffocated in open fields. Entire towns were buried under drifts of dirt. 2.5 million people abandoned their homes. They packed what little they had left and fled west, toward California, toward anything that wasn't this. These were the Okies, the broken, desperate, beautiful families that John Steinbeck would write about in The Grapes of Wrath. One of the largest mass migrations in American history, driven not by war, but by dust. America was watching its own heartland die, and everyone knew it, and nobody knew what to do. Until one man said he had an idea. In 1933, Franklin Roosevelt became President of the United States. He had inherited at the same moment the worst economic depression in American history and the worst ecological disaster in American history. 2 crises, both enormous, both demanding action, both arriving at once. Roosevelt was not a man who thought small. He gathered his scientists, his foresters, his soil experts. He told them to find answers. And one of those men, a forester named Raphael Zahn, came to him with a proposal so large, so strange, so almost impossible, that when he finished speaking, the room stayed quiet for a long moment. "Plant trees," Zahn said. "Not a few trees, not some trees along a river somewhere. A Shelterbelt. A series of long parallel lines of trees running north to south, stretching from the Canadian border all the way down to Texas, 1,000 miles long, 100 miles wide in some places, 200 million trees." The room was quiet. And then someone said what everyone was thinking. That has never been done, not anywhere in the history of human civilization. No country had ever attempted reforestation at this scale. Not China, not Russia, not the great empires of Europe. Nobody. The idea of deliberately planting a forest across a semi-arid grassland that barely received 20 inches of rain a year struck most experts as, at best, wildly optimistic, and at worst, delusional. Some scientists said it out loud, "This won't work." But Roosevelt looked at the dust still settling on the windows of the White House from a storm that had started 1,000 miles away, and he said something very simple. "We are going to try." In 1934, The Prairie States Forestry Project officially began. The plan was this: plant rows of trees, running east to west across farms stretching through 6 states: North Dakota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. The trees would act as windbreaks. When the wind came roaring across the flat open plains, it would hit the trees and slow down. Slower wind picks up less soil. Less soil in the air means fewer dust storms. Fewer dust storms means farms survive. Simple in theory, extraordinarily difficult in practice. The first problem was the trees themselves. You cannot plant a forest in a desert and expect it to survive. The foresters had to find species tough enough, stubborn enough, drought-resistant enough to grow in soil that had already been beaten half to death. They chose carefully: Osage orange, eastern red cedar, green ash, cottonwood, elm, hackberry, native trees mostly that had evolved over thousands of years to handle exactly this kind of punishment. The second problem was finding the people to plant them. This is where Roosevelt's New Deal showed its real genius. The Civilian Conservation Corps was already at work across America, putting unemployed young men to work on public lands. Now, thousands of them were sent to the plains. Many of them were from the very farm families the Dust Bowl had destroyed. Young men who had watched their fathers lose everything, who had never had a real paycheck in their lives, who were hungry and tired and desperate for purpose. They were given shovels, they were given saplings, they were paid $1 a day, and they sent most of it home. And they planted. Through brutal summer heat and howling winter winds, through exhaustion and doubt and the skepticism of neighbors who thought the whole thing was a government fantasy, they planted. Year after year after year, and slowly, impossibly, stubbornly, the trees began to grow. By the time the project wound down in 1942, when the Second World War shifted every resource toward a different kind of crisis, what had been built was almost beyond comprehension. More than 220 million trees had been planted. 18,600 miles of shelterbelts stretched across the 6 plain states. If you laid every one of those trees end to end, they would circle the entire Earth more than twice. And the results were not a fantasy. They were real. Studies showed that wind speeds dropped by as much as 50% in the fields behind the shelter belts. Crop yields on protected farms were measurably, consistently higher than on farms without trees. Soil moisture was better. The microclimate around the trees was cooler in summer, warmer in winter. And something else happened. Something nobody had put in the plan. The birds came back. The wildlife came back. The trees created habitat where there had been nothing. Deer returned, pheasants returned. Songbirds that hadn't been heard in these fields for a decade came back and nested in the branches of young cedars and cottonwoods. The living wall was doing more than anyone had promised. It was bringing a dead land back to life. But there is a part of this story that almost never gets told. The land where those 220 million trees were planted once belonged to the Lakota, the Comanche, the Cheyenne, the Kiowa, the Arapaho. These were peoples who had understood for thousands of years exactly how to live on this land without destroying it. They had balanced their lives against the rhythms of the plains. They had moved with the seasons. They had taken only what the land could give. They were driven off by the United States government. Their buffalo, 60 million animals, were deliberately, systematically slaughtered within a single generation because killing the buffalo was the fastest way to break the people who depended on them. The farmers who replaced them destroyed the land in less than 50 years, and the government that had taken the land from the people who knew how to live on it then spent millions of dollars trying to fix the damage their replacement plan had caused. The Dust Bowl was not a natural disaster. It was a man-made catastrophe built on the erasure of people who had already solved the problem we pretended was unsolvable. That is worth sitting with. So, did the Shelterbelt actually work? The honest answer is yes, and it is complicated. Yes, the wind slowed. Yes, the soil held. Yes, crops improved. Yes, the evidence is real and documented and not in serious scientific dispute. But the Dust Bowl did not end only because of the trees. The drought broke in the early 1940s, and the rains returned. And when the rains returned, the crisis eased regardless. What we know for certain is what happened during the next major plains drought in the 1950s. That drought was severe, but it was not another Dust Bowl. The Shelterbelts held. The catastrophe did not repeat at the same scale. Was that because of the trees? Partly, probably significantly, but you cannot run a controlled experiment on a continent. 220 million trees, planted by desperate people in an impossible situation, made the land more resilient. And when the next test came, the land did not break the same way. That is not nothing. That is everything. But here is the part of the story where the heart drops a little. After the Second World War, commodity prices rose sharply. Farming became more mechanized. The great new combines and harvesters needed vast, uninterrupted fields to operate efficiently. And farmers started looking at those lines of trees. A Shelterbelt is also a strip of land that isn't producing crops. And when you're trying to survive economically, that math starts to feel different than it did during a dust storm. The government subsidies that had helped maintain the Shelterbelts dried up. The political will that had built them faded. And slowly, quietly, row by row and tree by tree, the Shelterbelts began to come down. By some estimates, nearly 70% of the original trees planted in the 1930s are now gone. The wall that took thousands of workers nearly a decade to build has been quietly, incrementally dismantled over the past 80 years. And the Great Plains today? In some areas, the soil is in worse condition than it was before the Dust Bowl. The Ogallala Aquifer, the massive underground reservoir that now irrigates the entire region, has been drawn down to a fraction of its original size. Some scientists estimate it could be effectively depleted within a generation. We may be building the conditions for a second Dust Bowl, and we have already torn down most of the wall we built to stop the first one. And yet the story does not end there. Because what America did in the 1930s did not stay in the 1930s. Right now, China is running the largest tree planting project in human history. 66 billion trees planted since 1978. A green wall stretching across the northern edge of the country, trying to stop the advancing Gobi Desert. Right now, across the Sahel region of Africa, 11 countries are working together to build the Great Green Wall of Africa, a living barrier of trees and vegetation stretching 5,000 miles across the southern edge of the Sahara. Both projects were inspired, directly and explicitly, by what a desperate American government did on the Great Plains in the 1930s. The idea traveled. The hope traveled. Because the lesson of the Shelterbelt is simple and it is enormous. When we break the natural systems that protect us, we can sometimes, if we choose to, begin to repair them. It takes political courage, it takes money, it takes years of labor and decades of patience. It requires us to think beyond the next harvest, the next election, the next quarterly report. But it can be done. 220 million trees, planted by young men who had nothing, from families who had lost everything, in the middle of the worst decade America had seen in a century. It can be done. Drive through the Great Plains today. Drive through Kansas or Nebraska or the Oklahoma Panhandle on a long, flat highway with nothing but sky ahead of you. And sometimes, if you know what you are looking for, you will see them. Lines of old trees running east to west across the landscape. Cottonwoods with trunks as wide as a man's arm span. Red cedars gone gnarled and dark with age. Elms that have survived 100 plains winters and are still standing. They do not look dramatic from a distance. They look like trees. But those trees were planted by a 22-year-old in 1937 who had never owned anything in his life, who was earning $1 a day and sending 80 cents of it home to a family that needed every penny, who planted 100 saplings before lunch and 100 more before sunset, who went home aching and sunburned and probably doubting whether any of it would matter. He planted them knowing he would never see them grow tall. He planted them anyway. And 80 years later, those trees are still there, still slowing the wind, still holding the soil, still offering shade to a hawk banking low over a wheat field, or a deer stepping out of the tree line at dusk, or a child on a farm who doesn't know yet that those trees are the reason their family's land is still farmable. The Great Plains Shelterbelt is one of the most ambitious, most forgotten, most quietly extraordinary things America has ever done. A wall, not of stone, not of steel, a wall of living things, built by broken people in a broken time to protect a broken land. And it worked. And that has to mean something for what we do next.